Chapter 8. The Guardhouse. As it happens, Peppercorn saw no fireworks the night of the Master's birthday celebrations. He did not enjoy the pageantry and drama of the display, saw no explosions of colour, no showers of sparks or fire flowers, and though he heard the reports of the basilisks, he saw no flames or fire either. He was saved also the tumult and turmoil of the warehouse fire at the Sunstrig, of the sight of flames licking up wall and shingle, devouring boardwalk timbers and consuming ancient bridges, collapsing, hissing and steaming into the black waters of the lake. And he knew nothing of the unfortunate demise of the villain Shillabeer either. For a moment he had felt something while he sat upon the filthy floor of his cell, something unexplainable, something primal, a fleeting sense of fire, but that was all, nothing more. But it could not have been the fire at the covert that he had sensed. How could it? There were no windows in the cell in which he was imprisoned at the heart of the guardhouse, no opening to admit the smoke that drifted across the city's rooftops, or to witness the glow that lit up the night sky like the coming of dawn. In this respect the guardhouse was not meant to be welcoming. It was unpleasant by design and frightening for anyone unfortunate enough to be imprisoned there, incommodious even for its more irregular lodgers. For one such as Peppercorn, unaccustomed to being indoors, who had lived his entire life free of the constraints of walls and roofs, unencumbered by the constrictions of windows and doors, the turn of the jailer's key was even more dread-filled than for most. The jailer had unlocked and thrown open the door, flooding the room beyond with the light of his lantern, revealing a small cell, not much bigger in either direction than a full-grown man lying down. The walls were rough-hewn planks, which Peppercorn guessed would be of a good thickness. There were no windows, of course, for they were in the centre of a labyrinth of corridors and cells, and as such a long way from an outside wall. The door itself had a small opening by way of a window, and despite it being too small for even a child to climb through, it had been furnished with bars just to make doubly sure. Apart from a thin scattering of old straw, which by the smell was long past needing replacing, the cell was empty. No bench, no bed, no bucket. The only other feature being an iron ring fastened through the timbers of the furthest wall, through which, once he was inside and shoved roughly to his knees, the guard passed the chain of his wrist manacles before refastening them even tighter than before. Enclosed by close walls and roof confined, locked within and able to leave, now Peppercorn knew how the small songbirds must feel, who were displayed in the bazaar, imprisoned in their tiny cages, barely big enough to spread their wings or stretch their throats to sing. Who the last occupant of the cell had been, Pepper did not know, nor was there any way of telling. Nonetheless, they had left their stench in the little room, mingled with that of the rotting straw, which formed something of a slimy mat that was, no doubt, alive with fleas and lice. Once the door was shut and locked, the smell became almost overwhelming, and it was an hour at least before he became the least bit accustomed to it. Peppercorn was not troubled by sitting upon the floor, which was lucky really, for there was no other option. Sitting and sleeping on bare boards had become like second nature over the years, and though he still felt the discomfort of it, he had become inured to the pain. At least these boards are out of the wind and rain, he thought to himself, trying to put a positive spin on his circumstances. The truth was, he was scared and alone, and would have liked to cry, but he knew crying would achieve nothing and get him nowhere, and would serve only to lower his spirits. So he took a deep, steadying breath, set his jaw, and began to think about how he could get out of there. He would have liked to stand a bit and stretch his legs by walking about, but the chain of his manacles was not long enough to allow such a luxury. He could see he was going to have to do something about that. Though he could not see it, he ran his fingers along the chain that held the manacles together. It was thick and substantial. Each link, he could tell, had been fire-welded closed, making it impossible to break apart. Then he felt for the locks, fixed at his wrist through the chain and the cuffs that held the manacles fast. He explored the metalwork for a moment, the heavy body of the lock and the locking bar, and realised he knew the type well, had seen such locks used throughout Laketown, and had even opened them on occasion. It required a key, the key which the jailer had used to fasten the manacles and then taken away with him. But there was more than one way to skin a cat, or so the saying goes. He hadn't exactly learned nothing living on the streets. There wasn't a lock in Laketown he couldn't pick if he had the right tools. Unfortunately, the right tools were stashed in a leather roll in a chest in his cabin aboard the Farthing. Still, Pepper thought to himself, where there's a will there's a way, or so the missus was fond of saying. And so he set his mind to the problem at hand. How was he to get the key from the jailer? Or what could he use, in the absence of his tools, to pick the locks? And he had been mulling these questions over but a very short time when he drifted into sleep. For most, it would have been hard to sleep in such conditions, but not for Peppercorn. He was used to worse. A roof over his head was an improvement to his normal arrangements. But still he slept fitfully, tossing and turning, dreaming of fighting and fleeing, and waking often only to be reminded of his unhappy circumstances before drifting back into his dreams. And what unsettling dreams they were, reliving the confrontation with the provost men outside the roost and the spectral figure of the mysterious black-veiled man. He was awoken the following morning by a hoarse cry of "Breakfast!" that came from outside his cell, accompanied by the sound of a key turning in the lock and the door being thrown open, flooding the small cell with light that rounded on him like a scalding harridan. He blinked several times until his eyes were accustomed to the unforgiving brightness of the light, and no sooner had they regained their faculty than he wished they hadn't. What the jailer had called breakfast was in fact a husk of hard, stale bread and a slice of cold, rancid bacon, the stink of which Peppercorn thought would have troubled maggots and blowflies. And worse than the sight of the breakfast, following hot on the jailer's heels and entering the cell behind him, came no other than Beaky Breakwater, the very reason that Peppercorn was locked up in the guardhouse in the first place. "Morning, Peppercorn," said the provostman, a little too jovially for the setting. "It is Peppercorn, isn't it? That's what your friends call you." Pepper did not answer, but feigned interest in the bread and bacon, lifting it to his nose to sniff and then immediately wishing he had not. "Thank you, Pike," Frommager said dismissively, turning to the jailer. "You may leave us for a moment. I have some business I need to discuss with Master Peppercorn here." Pike looked a little put out to be dismissed so, but turned all the same and left the cell, not unlike a dog that has been put out in the rain. But not before Peppercorn had noted the ring of keys that hung upon the jailer's belt, a couple of large silver keys, the kind that was used for door locks, and a single small brass key that might unlock wrist bracelets or manacles. "No use beating around the bush," the proctor began, rubbing his hands together as if a deal had already been struck between them. "I have a simple but fair proposal, beneficial to us both." Peppercorn, still seated upon the rotting straw, continued to feign interest in his meagre breakfast. "If you will but tell me where your treasure is, I can have you out of this place in 2 shakes," Beaky continued in a tone of exaggerated friendliness. "And there's an end to the business. I'm not an unreasonable man, Peppercorn, and you will remember my veiled friend. He is not without influence in the city. Say the word, and he will have you out of here in a trice." He looked at Peppercorn with an expression of expectation. Peppercorn did indeed remember the factor's veiled friend, remembered the fright it gave him when he saw him at the roost in the company of the provost men. Moreover, he remembered the remote black sail that had hounded them for weeks out on the lake, and he remembered the 3 veiled men who had tried to steal the dragon's treasure, who he had chased around the postern, and could not help thinking they were in some way all connected. Still, he said nothing and made no reply to Master Breakwater's proposal. When the factor continued, it was in an altogether more threatening tone. "If you will not tell me what I want to know," he warned, "I will see to it that you rot in here, or worse, in one of the Master's prison hulks, where you will be forgot, and in years to come, when you are but a vague and distant memory, those who once knew you will question whether they had imagined it or not." "If you know my name," replied Peppercorn, "you'll also know that I am penniless, that I have no family, no home, and not so much as a brass penny to my name. Ask anyone who knows me. Ask Goggins, the harbour master, or Grubb, on whose fishing boat I crew. They will all tell you the same, every one. I am an orphan and I am destitute. As for treasure, I've never seen any treasure and can't begin to imagine what it is you refer to." "Oh, yes," said Master Breakwater, nodding sagely, as if he had expected such a response. "Oh, they said you would say as much. Yes, you're a slippery one and no mistake, trying to trick me with your speech-making. I might not be as learned as some, Master Peppercorn, but I'm not as green as you might think neither. Still, if you don't want no part of my generous offer to help you out of your situation, then perhaps a few more nights on the floor there might change your mind. When you are ready to talk, tell Pike to send for me, and we can have you out of this filthy place in no time." And so saying, he turned and left the cell, slamming the door shut behind him. Plunged back into darkness, Peppercorn was left alone once more with his predicament and his thoughts. The hard bread he gnawed at absent-mindedly while he considered his situation and Master Breakwater's generous offer. Of course, he would not give up his treasure, not to Beaky Breakwater, no more than he would eat the reeking bacon. No, he would not eat the bacon, but he had begun to hatch a plan for which it might come in handy. Doing his best to ignore the awful smell, he rubbed it instead around his wrists and hands, smearing them with the rancid fat in the hope that it would loosen his hands enough that they could be drawn out of the manacles. He tried first one hand and then the other, twisting and pulling for all he was worth, but alas, it was to no avail. The bands of the manacles were too tight, even for his child's hands to squeeze through, with or without the slippery fat. If only he could get hold of the brass key, he thought, the one he had seen upon Pike's key loop. Then he could free himself from the shackles at least, and that would greatly improve his odds of escaping. But it was no good. He could see no way of attaining the key and, without the key, of escaping the cell. The day did indeed pass slowly, as Master Breakwater had predicted, and increasingly uncomfortably. Standing up and stretching his limbs was a simple enough liberty, and one that it would seem Peppercorn had taken for granted all his life, and not until it was taken away from him did he realise what a pleasure it was. With spirits low and a growing feeling of despair, Peppercorn began to second-guess his resolve. Perhaps there was nothing else for it but to tell Master Breakwater where the treasure was. But even then he could not trust the factor to arrange for his release from the guardhouse. More likely, he would ensure that Peppercorn was never freed, never to be seen or heard of again. After a long, cheerless day, his mind busy with the many details of his seemingly inescapable predicament, Peppercorn drifted once more into an inscrutable slumber. But that is not all that happened that night, far from it. Something very strange happened, something inexplicable, something magical even. As he slept upon the rank straw on the floor of his cell, Peppercorn dreamed a dream, a very realistic dream, indeed a very extraordinary dream. In this dream, Peppercorn was in his cell, the same cell he was actually in, sat upon the floor, the same floor upon which he slept, his wrists shackled with manacles through a ring in the wall. Yet in his dream, a second version of himself stood in the place of the door, looking down upon his first self, and as he looked, he saw his second self reaching into the pocket of his waistcoat and drawing out a key, a brass key, the same as the one he had seen hanging upon the belt of Pike the jailer. Inserting the key into the lock of the shackles, his dream self turned the key and he looked on as the lock sprung open, releasing the manacle bands from around his wrists. With his hands now free, he looked on as the seated Peppercorn slipped the brass key into the small pocket of his waistcoat. How strange, he remembered thinking to himself, how the sleeping mind replays and reenacts those worries and troubles of the waking day. It was at this point that he awoke, stirred no doubt from his sleep by the gruff but distant voice of Master Pike, going from cell to cell along one of the adjoining corridors with his morning salutation of "Breakfast!" If only, he thought with sadness, as the reality of his situation returned, if only his dream had been real and he was free. But it was just a dream. That is what he told himself, and his heart sank once more with the realisation of his continued imprisonment. Yet he could not get the dream from out of his thoughts. He had dreamed many times before, both in restive or restless sleep, dreamed many dreams, but none that had ever felt so real to him. No, nor so vivid that he would have sworn he was awake. None that had made him ponder them or search them thus for meaning. And it was as he mulled these things over, playing through once more the sequence of the dreams, that he absent-mindedly patted the pocket of his waistcoat, and on the instant his heart began to pound with excitement. There was something in his pocket, something firm and unyielding like metal. Quickly he dug finger and thumb into the little pocket and, fishing excitedly about, he drew out a key, a small brass key no less. It was too much to believe. How could this be? He had dreamt that the jailer's key was in his waistcoat pocket, and now here he was with a key in his pocket. A key that had not been there before, a key that he did not doubt would unlock his shackles. He wasted no more time but fitted the key into the keyhole of the left manacle, and, just as it had in the dream, the key turned smoothly in the lock, the arm springing open with a satisfying snap. Letting the manacle and chain drop to the floor, he rubbed thoughtfully at his now free wrist with his still shackled hand. Amazing as this was, it did not spell his freedom. With one more turn of the key, his hands would both be free, allowing him to stand once more, but there was still the locked cell door, Pike the jailer, any number of guards, and a labyrinth of passageways between him and freedom. That was when Peppercorn heard Pike, directly outside his door, the key being worked into the lock and the jailer's voice calling through the bars, "Breakfast!" Quick, he thought, snatching up the manacles and fitting it once more around his wrist. I must not let the jailer see that my hand is free. It seemed absurd to be locking himself back into the chains when all he wanted was to be free. Still, he locked the cuff and returned the key to his pocket, and just in time too, for he was no sooner shackled again than the cell door was thrown open, and in came Master Pike, accompanied once more by a halo of searing light. "Breakfast!" he growled. "Come on, let's be having you. No sleeping in at this hotel." And he threw down a bowl of what, on a cursory inspection, Peppercorn imagined must once have been some kind of porridge. Jabbing it with a finger, he could see it was now a single solid mass, cold and browning on the surface. How anything that had once contained liquid of any kind could become that dry was a mystery. His disgust must have shown upon his face. "Make the most of our hospitality, boy," said the jailer vindictively, "for I have an order that on the morrow you shall be moved to the Oaks, and you shall find no such luxury there, mark you." This news was even more dismaying and harder to swallow than the porridge, which, like the bacon before it, Peppercorn could not eat. Pike did not linger to exchange pleasantries, but having delivered Peppercorn his bad news, left to continue his breakfast service. And no sooner had the door closed again, shutting out once more the light of the corridor beyond, but Peppercorn hurriedly felt for the key in his pocket. In a world where such magic existed, he did not doubt but that a key could disappear from a pocket as easily and suddenly as it had appeared. And it was to his great relief that he found the key was still there, and he wasted no time in unlocking both wrists. Now that he was free from his chains, all that remained was to escape the cell, which, if you remember, was locked from the outside, with the key safe upon the jailer's belt. Perhaps I will dream a key as I sleep tonight, he thought to himself as he paced through the darkness, finally able to stretch his aching legs. But no, he decided that was too much to hope for, or at least too much on which to pin all his hopes. He would need another plan, something more concrete than dreaming. And then it struck him. He would wait until the morning when the jailer would open the cell door to give him his breakfast, whatever horror that proved to be. Then, taking him by surprise, for who would expect Peppercorn still to be manacled, he would make a dash for the open door and take his chances with whatever lay beyond. So began the process of planning his route from his cell to freedom, of racking his brains, trying desperately to remember the course they had taken on their way in from the main gate room of the guardhouse, where last he had seen the skipper and old Tom. From here they had marched him through corridors and passageways, past cells and guard rooms, until they had come at last to his own cell. That is how he passed the remainder of the day, another long day as it turned out, going over and over in his head, pacing the cell as he walked it in his mind. After some time he felt sure he had remembered it all. He had spent hours reenacting the route he would take over and over, and considering what he might do if a door were locked or a passageway guarded. And though it was not yet the day's end, at length Peppercorn found himself drifting off to sleep. Just how long he had slept Peppercorn was not sure, when he was awoken with a start by a sudden noise. It was a voice, or so it had seemed to Peppercorn, as he passed from sleeping to waking. And as he opened his eyes, who should be standing before him but Elisande himself, large as life in the centre of the cell. It was still pitch dark, who knew what hour of the day or night it was, but for the weak lantern light that spilled through the door bars. But there was no mistaking him. It was Elisande sure enough, and immediately Peppercorn jumped to his feet, the shackles clattering to the floor, and came forward as if to embrace the old man. "Do not touch me!" commanded the mage, throwing up his hands to ward off the boy's advance. Peppercorn stopped in his tracks. "Do not touch me," he repeated, but this time with less force. "Why?" asked the boy, taken aback by the old man's reserve. "What you see," the mage explained, "is not my mortal body, but my spirit alone, and cannot be touched, not without risking harm to us both." "Are you a ghost?" asked Peppercorn aghast. "Did the provost-men kill you after all?" No, Elisande assured. "I am in spirit, but I am not dead." "But," began the boy. "I will explain all in good time," said the mage, cutting him short. "First things first." They were interrupted at this point by a sudden thumping on the door and a grating voice at the bars. "Quiet in there!" someone called from outside the cell. "People are trying to sleep. Quiet, or I'll come in there and learn you some manners." Elisande waited for a moment, then continued in a whisper. "We need to get you out of here, but I fear it is not going to prove so easy." "Easy enough," replied Peppercorn confidently. "If you can just open the door, then I'm sure I can do the rest." "The door and the corridor beyond are heavily guarded," said Elisande. "Even if I could open the door, which I cannot, you would not get beyond a few yards before the guards caught or killed you." "Then what is to be done?" asked the boy, sounding a little more uneasy. "There are two ways out of this cell," Elisande explained. "The door, which we have ascertained, is not a viable option." "And what is the second way?" asked Peppercorn, who could see or think of no other way out. "Look beneath your feet," said the mage. "Straw," replied the boy, and he toed a lump of the sodden straw with his bare foot. "Beneath the straw," continued the mage, "there you will find your escape." Straight away Peppercorn knew what he meant. Since the city was built above the lake, and the water lapped at the bottom of the buildings, there were no cellars or vaults to be found in Laketown, no crypts or basements, but what the buildings of Laketown did have, if they were built upon the lowest level, houses and workshops, warehouses and guardhouses alike, was a trapdoor of sorts, opening onto the lake's surface, what the residents of Laketown called a water gate. These water gates were used for a multitude of reasons, namely the delivery of goods, the taking away of goods, or for the easy disposal of household waste. Indeed, some buildings had more than one water gate, and the guardhouse, it would seem, was no exception. "This cell used to be part of the old guardhouse pantry and storerooms," explained Elisande. "The gate beneath the straw is where they would sometimes bring in provisions and take out empty crates and barrels." Peppercorn wasted no time, but falling to his knees, began to scrape back the damp and fusty straw, sending insects that he disturbed in his work scurrying for cover, revealing the wooden boards beneath. "And how do you come all of a sudden to know so much of the guardhouse?" Peppercorn asked as he worked. "I've not been idle since your jailing, Peppercorn. There are those in Laketown who have either served at one time or another in the guardhouse, and many more who, like yourself, have been unwilling guests here, and they will tell much to an interesting person who is paying for their ale." Soon Peppercorn's fingers came upon a metal ring recessed into the boards of the floor. "I have it," he said excitedly, lifting and tugging at the ring, pulling with all his might. But it was to no avail. It did not budge, nor did the trapdoor yield. "You cannot lift it if you are stood upon it," observed Elisanda. This was of course true, but in his excitement to escape, Peppercorn had overlooked this simple fact. And so he continued to clear away the straw, pushing it to the edges of the room where it piled up against the walls, revealing the full extent of the opening. "Of all the many cells throughout the guardhouse," exclaimed Peppercorn, standing back to observe his work, "what are the chances that I end up in one with a water gate? Is this the good wheel that has eluded me all my life?" he wondered. "Perhaps my luck is beginning to turn." "Luck has played little if any part in the events of your life, Peppercorn. For better or for worse, the fates have marked you out, steered and piloted you to where you find yourself this night, and I do not doubt but that they will play a greater part in your stars before they are done with you." "If the poor fortune I have suffered all my life has been a gift of the fates," returned Peppercorn, still searching the floor for the edges of the gate, "I should sooner they removed their noses from my business. I want none of their help, for I have had more than my fill of it." "Once you are free of this place," said Elisanda, as Peppercorn tried once more to lift the trapdoor, "go to the Forain, to the Manish." "But I do not know anyone of the Manish," Peppercorn enjoined. "Go to the Manish, ask for Hadar, tell her that I sent you, that Elisanda sent you." In the blink of an eye, the mage was gone. 1 second he was there, the next he had vanished. But there was no time to reason it out now. At some point, not too distant, the sun would be rising, and before the new day was out, he would find himself transported to one of the prison hulks, and few there were who ever returned from there, and those that did were never the same as before they went. No, there was no time to waste. If he was going to escape from the guardhouse, he would have to do it now. Taking the ring firmly in both hands, Peppercorn began to lift the trapdoor, which was fitted very snugly to its aperture, and felt as though it had been many years since last it had been opened. It did not lift easily, and it took all his strength to break the seal of dirt and muck that had held it so tightly closed. Heaving it up and open, and letting it fall back upon the cell floor, a powerful aroma immediately rose up from the blackness beneath, a terrible stench that caught at the back of his throat and turned his stomach. It was a smell he knew all too well. Night soil and sewage. The guardhouse latrines must empty into the lake somewhere near here, he thought, and he was suddenly filled with a dread that if he was going to escape this way, he was going to have to swim through such water. He would not have been happy at the prospect of having to swim beneath the city at the best of times. The water beneath Laketown was black and stagnant. You could not have thousands of people living above the water for thousands of years and it not have some ill effect. But here in the Sinistral, it was at its worst, and beneath the guardhouse particularly. It wasn't that he was afraid of the swim. As you know, he could swim as well as anyone else upon the lake. But who knew what dangers lay in the murk of the stagnant depths beneath the Sinistral? All knew you did not swim, nor fish even, within half a mile of the city, and for very good reason. And what child of the city hadn't made themselves sick from playing in the lake? The waters under the city moved independently of the tides of the lake, with their own eddies and currents. Moreover, the water sat stagnant and unmoving beneath the city's boards, was befouled with all manner of things emptied into the canals and pools each day. Night soil, kitchen scraps, slag and spoil from the various furnaces and forges, fish guts, the sluicings of the abattoirs, all manner of poisonous and noxious waste. Add to this the filth of the guardhouse ordure. Well, not a pleasant prospect for anyone, however good their swimming skills, and one likely to infect the unhappy individual with disease and sickness. Having recoiled from the initial stink, Peppercorn took a step closer to look into the void and consider his course of action. It was black through the trapdoor, not dark, not shadowy, but black, without any light whatsoever. What little light had seeped through the door bars into the cell would not extend beyond the opening, and no light came from beneath, only an icy chill that lifted from off the black water. Bracing himself against the smell, he lay down on his stomach upon the wooden floor beside the opening, and with his head and shoulders overhanging the water, he craned his neck this way and that, looking in all directions, but could see nothing. He tried to remember the directions and distance they had walked from the entrance of the guardhouse, and took another look, in case he could see some distant light leaking weakly into the water, indicating where a canal might be. He could see nothing. There was nothing to see. From what he could remember, his cell was roughly in the middle of the guardhouse, about as far in any direction as he could get from freedom, he thought. Either way, it was a great distance to swim. 50 yards, he would guess, 100 maybe. He thought for a moment. 50 yards he could manage, if there were no additional obstructions, but that, he knew, could not be guaranteed. Beneath the buildings and boardwalks of Laketown, there were all manner of obstructions. Piers and piles, spars and stanchions of all shapes and sizes. Sometimes underwater walls had been constructed, piles of rock and timber to support the heavier parts of the city, not to mention the remains of old boats, sunken barges and rotten rowboats, all the filth and jetsam of the city. Even without such obstructions, 50 yards on a single breath would not be easy. But if he were to swim 50 yards only to find his way blocked, swimming back to the safety of his cell would be a push, especially blinded, as he would ostensibly be. A swim of 100 yards in such conditions as these, well, that was quite another thing altogether. Drawing his head from the opening, Peppercorn sat back upon his heels. What options did he have? Stay where he was and, at best, be left there for weeks, months maybe, never seeing the light of day, no one caring for Halfpenny or the rest of his boys, or end up being shipped off to one of the prison hulks to be shackled and ill-treated, misused and forgotten, to become some kind of caged animal. Having said that, from what he understood, life expectancy was not so great upon the hulks. Starvation, disease, violence, all took a terrible toll upon those confined within, and if one did not kill you, the others surely would. No, there was nothing for it, he thought. He would have to try, to take his chances with the water. Though drowning beneath the city was not an eventuality he wanted to consider, it was probably preferable to life in a prison hulk, however short a stay that might prove. Sitting now upon the edge of the opening, his legs dangling into the darkness beneath him, he carefully lowered himself over the brink and down to the water that lapped against the legs and underside of the building, a few feet beneath the floor. Then he dropped with a splash into the void. The water was cold, as he had expected, and he slipped into the darkness, the lake engulfing him and wrapping him in its frigid embrace. The cold gripped him like a vice, squeezing his chest, expelling air, taking away his breath. Rising back to the surface, he panted into the opening of the water gate, filling his lungs and shivering. He listened for a moment for any sound of Pike outside the cell, lest he had heard the splash or indeed the opening of the gate and had come to see what was amiss. All was still. No candlelight flickered at the door bars. He would have liked to close the water gate behind him, to hide for a while at least his method of escape, but it was impossible to do it from in the water. Good thing too, for though it might have been the wiser course of action, he would not have liked to think that there was no way back should his attempt at escape come to nothing. Though he shivered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably, he was used to being in cold water, just as he was used to the smell of stagnation that rose from the timbers beneath the building. If it meant his freedom from this place, he thought, he would happily endure both. Treading water, he paused to think one last time, to get his bearings and finalise in his mind what it was he was intending to do. He felt sure that the door of his cell faced north, and since north was the way he wanted to go, then that was the direction in which he would swim, in the hope that it would bring him to some landing in the northern parts of the Sinistral. He breathed deeply and purposefully to settle his nerves. Then, with no further reason to delay, he took a last deep breath and dived down beneath the water, kicking himself forward with powerful legs and pulling himself through the darkness with his arms. He was swimming, and there was no turning back. 5 yards, 10 yards he swam into the liquid darkness, forcing back the panic that began to rise from the pit of his stomach. 15 yards, 20, nothing to see, no way to know which way was up or down. Suddenly something brushed against his leg, something lithe and muscular, startling him, setting his heart once more to racing. He could only imagine what kind of creature might be living in the poisonous murk beneath the city, and he did not wish to linger long enough to meet it. He pushed on, 25 yards, 30 yards into the darkness. Suddenly his hand banged hard against some unseen thing, something solid and immovable, jarring his fingertips, tearing at his fingernails. A wooden piling, no doubt, or a strut holding up some part of the Sinistral. Rolling aside, he brushed the timbers and something dug deep into his shoulder, something jagged and sharp, a nail, a sliver of wood. It tore through his flesh, sending flashes of pain pulsing behind his eyes, making him want to cry out. Still on he swam, consumed by the pain and the growing need for air. Desperation. He needed to breathe. Then a thought struck him, a spark of hope perhaps. In most places, he knew, the buildings of the city rested a foot or so above the water, sometimes only a couple of inches. Even so, there would be space enough. Even if he had to press his face against the underside of the building, there would be space enough, a pocket of air. That's all he would need. He turned and pushed upward, his hunger for breath growing, his face toward the surface. He had gone but a foot or so when he struck the floor of the building above him, hitting it with a hard thud that rattled through his bones and shook him to the frame. There was no gap, not so much as an inch, and no space for air. Instead, the water rested against the floorboards, the timbers encrusted with barnacles and limpets. The sharp points of the shells lacerated the flesh of his forehead, nose and cheek. He let out a mouthful of precious air. Filthy water filled his mouth. He could not cry out, as was his body's instinct. He could not rub the spot free of pain. He could not groan or sigh or gasp. There was no time. On he swam, shaken and hurting. This was bad. He knew this would not end well. Water filled his nostrils and mouth and down his throat. He wanted to cough, but he knew if he did, that would be his end. Groping onward, Peppercorn pulled himself through the blackness. He had been swimming for several minutes now, in complete darkness. He had gone 30 or 40 yards without breath, and still there was no sign that his ordeal was coming to its end. He began to feel the panic growing once more, rising, taking control of his thoughts and movements. He imagined his lungs filling with the cold, dark lake water, expelling all the air and all life with it, and for a moment he was overcome by an irresistible urge to give up, to simply stop swimming, to embrace his inevitable death. He could imagine the peace that would engulf him like a warm blanket, soothing him to the bottom of the lake, where he would drift into an endless sleep. And it was at that point, just as he was about to give in to the irresistible urge to die, that he saw it. Something that caught his eye, something glinting in the distant darkness, a light, or the hint of a light, faint and thin, but there nonetheless, there where before there had been no light. Like a star fallen from the heavens, swimming through the lake, leading him to safety. On he pushed, kicking with renewed hope, lungs and chest burning, desperate to draw breath, fighting the instinct to breathe, his whole body screaming out for air, his head and shoulders throbbing with pain. On he swam regardless, on toward the glimmering point of light. On he pushed, drawn by the light, summoning every ounce of strength and resolve. Still there was darkness overhead, a faint rumour of the buildings above. No respite, no relief. It was too much. He wanted to cry. He could go no further. He had to breathe. His chest was on fire. Star or no star, he gave in. He stopped kicking, stopped swimming and surrendered, abandoning himself to the lake. He floated, weightless in the blackness and sure which way was up or down. No more did he shiver. As he floated, suspended in the black void, his thoughts turned to his friends. He saw their faces, those he loved like family, those who relied on him, Halfpenny, Baldwin, Giles, Dimmock. He saw the skipper and the missus, he saw their boys. He knew he would never see them again. This was the end. Slowly he rose. He did not resist the water or the darkness, and to his great surprise he did not come against the hard wooden floor. Instead, his face broke the surface. Cold night air rushed upon him, bathing his face and wounds, his mouth wide open, gaping and gasping. No longer were there dark buildings above him, only an endless night sky, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen.